Hey, welcome back to the program here on Coastal Daybreak on the Talk Station FM 107 and AM 1240. Our next guest is the author of Apollo 13 and also The Sibling Effect. Been a Time writer, Times magazine science editor and senior writer for a couple of decades now, and written a number of cover stories for that. Joins us with his new book called Apollo 8, and it's Jeffrey Kluger with us. Hi, Jeffrey. How are you?
Very good. Thank you so much for having me.
Are you in New York today?
I am in New York today, going up to an unseasonable 88 here.
yeah, well, we're about the same weather here today. This is I love this book. I'm so glad that finally we get around to the real story and a comprehensive story of Apollo 8. I think a lot of people, and I'm a space nerd, but I mean, a lot of people don't follow 13, or they know about the moon landing, but they don't know how significant this voyage was.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, people always think of Apollo 11 as the first time people got to the moon, but in fact, that was the first time people walked. Right. Apollo 8 was the first time human beings became a species of two worlds. Now, I mean, I think about this sometimes, that for the entirety of human evolutionary history, we had been a species locked at the bottom of the gravity well of Earth. And it was only with Apollo 8 that we pulled ourselves away from the planet, flew out over the true waters of deep space, sailed into the gravity field of another world, and went into orbit around it. Apollo 8, the astronauts of Apollo 8 essentially became beings of the moon. They orbited the moon 10 times. They did it on Christmas Eve, 1968, which was just the most rhapsodic possible ending for that terrible year. And they became the first human eyes, or any living eyes, to see the far side of the moon. Remember, the moon has kept its face toward us for 4.5 billion years. No one had ever seen the far side before.
This is such a fascinating story, and I remember it well. And being in radio and a little bit about dead air, but I never. I mean, that was probably one time when so many people sat on edge when they went around the dark side of the moon and out of radio contact.
Well, exactly, and there were two critical times. I mean, every orbit, every one of the 10 times they went around the moon, there was blackout for about 35 minutes when they were on the far side. But the first and last orbits were the most hair-raising, because the first orbit, it was on the far side that they were going to have to burn their engine to slow down just enough to get into lunar orbit. If that engine overburned, they were going to crash into the surface of the moon. So they went into radio blackout, and nobody knew that if they were going to come out. 10 orbits later, when they were burning their engine to come out of lunar orbit and head home, that time they had to accelerate. They were on the far side of the moon. If that engine burn had failed, and one of the wives of the Apollo 8 crew pointed this out, if that engine burn had failed, NASA would have effectively ruined the moon for everybody, for all of future history, because those three guys would have been trapped in lunar orbit forever and ever and ever, flying around it in this $100 million sarcophagus that was the Apollo 8 spacecraft. Nobody could have looked at the moon without thinking of the three dead men. It was a really terrifying moment.
Three of the most interesting characters, probably two we know better than the third here, but there were of those astronauts that went into space, with Frank Borman and Jim Lovell especially, but also Anders, who probably is the least known of the three, but they were great personalities also.
They were terrific personalities. All three of them were military men. All three of them were combat or test pilots. Borman saw himself, he admits this actually, that he was very buttoned up, very serious, just a hard-working grind. And, I've met him a few times, and he has a wonderful sense of humor now at age 88, but he admits that, when he was 38, not so much. He was a very serious man, and he took this mission for all of its exploratory wonder and all of the history they were about to make. He took it as a battle in the Cold War. He had trained to be a combat pilot. He had trained to fight in the Korean War. He had to be grounded for about 8 months during the Korean War because of a ruptured eardrum, and as a result, he never wound up being deployed to Korea, so he always felt he hadn't had his chance to fight his war. And when he was assigned to this mission, when he applied to NASA and was assigned to this mission, he felt like, this is my chance. This is a battle in the Cold War, and this is one I'm determined to win. When he came home, he never again thought about going back into space. He thought, I was given my mission. I succeeded at my mission. I've had enough. Jim Lovell, on the other hand, whom I've known for years and, feel lucky to call a friend, Jim, as I say in the book, was never so happy as when he was in space. He adored being in space. So even when he was halfway to the moon, he was already thinking ahead to, I can't wait to come back here in a year or two, this time with a lunar module, so this time I can complete that final 60 miles and land on the surface of the moon. And Bill Anders he was the rookie. He had the wheel spun, the coin flipped, and they said, well, Mr. First-Timer, you have never been in space before, and this time your first mission is going to be as part of the first crew of human beings to see the moon. It was just an extraordinary trio of men.
One of the other personalities kind of is on the ground that we all watched as well is Walter Cronkite. And his coverage of the moon launches. His coverage of the moon launches with Wally Schirra by his side in many of those they were fascinating.
Absolutely, and Cronkite, as I say in the book, he was like a little boy. He was completely honest that he looked at rocket ships the way a kid looks at locomotives. He just couldn't get enough of them. He absolutely loved them. And I've listened to some wonderful recordings of Schirra in his rickety temporary broadcast booth about a mile or two from the launch pad when the Saturn V rockets were going up. And the entire building was shaking. The technicians in the booth with him had to run up and hold the giant plate glass window in place so it wouldn't come crashing down on them. You would think he'd be afraid. He's having the time of his life when you listen to these recordings. He just was a man who fell in love with rockets, who made himself a sort of self-taught scholar of this entire industry and this entire field, and was deeply admired by the astronauts for it. And I think it's wonderful that, here we are 48 years after the first moon landing, and, all of the networks were on when Neil Armstrong stepped out onto the lunar surface, but the clip we always see is Cronkite watching these guys step down. And I think that was, that's fitting, because he was sort of America's wonderful uncle taking us through this incredible adventure.
I remember Schirra and Cronkite actually kind of being giggly at one point where they're talking about the weather on the moon. He says, well, there isn't any, and they laugh.
Exactly.
This is also a point in history, as you make an excellent point of in your book. Again, Jeffrey Kluger is our guest, the book Apollo 8, about 1968, assassinations, riots. It's just an awful year. But here we are on Christmas Eve, and what does Frank Borman do? But read Scripture.
It's Christmas Eve. These guys got out there. The world was bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. And on Christmas Eve, they turned that camera out the window. They showed humanity, the lunar horizon crawling by beneath them, something no one had ever seen before. They gave a little bit of a tour, and then they read the word Genesis on Christmas Eve. These are the words of birth, and for the U.S. that year, the words of rebirth. And it was a way, I think, look, I've said in some of the talks I've done, the people who died that year died all the same. The wars that were fought that year were fought all the same. There was no way you could fix that year, but you could redeem it at least a little bit. And for all of humanity, they redeemed that year. You can be a person of faith, you can be an atheist, it didn't matter. If you saw that broadcast and heard those words of Scripture and weren't just overcome by this sense of accomplishment and wonder, you have no heart. I don't know how anybody could remain unmoved by what they saw.
Jeffrey Kluger, The Thrilling Story of the First Mission to the Moon, Apollo 8 is the book. Jeffrey, thanks for joining us this morning. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
This is Coastal Daybreak here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. More to come in a moment.